You're listening to The Conversation Weekly. Black smoke billowed into the sky above the diplomatic quarter in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
2 drones impacting the US embassy here in Riyadh. Ministry of Defense officials here say that it made minor damage and lit a fire. No indications of casualties.
The Iranian drone attack on the US embassy on March the 3rd did little damage, but it was a signal of a profound shift in the Middle East. After Israel and the US bombed Iran, killing the country's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, Iran hit out at its neighbours. These Gulf states, which have worked for decades to cement themselves as a hub for finance, for tourism, as an oasis of security, are now under attack. Hotels in Dubai, ports in Oman, a gas facility in Qatar. Saudi Arabia and Iran have a long and bitter rivalry, but in recent years, the Saudis had begun building a new diplomatic relationship with Iran, even as they and other Gulf states hosted American military bases and courted American investment. Now they find themselves in the middle of the very regional conflict they'd hoped to avoid. Were they blindsided, or did some actually want the US to attack Iran? With the US and Israel seemingly calling the shots, what will the Gulf states do now? I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. In this episode, how the Gulf's delicate balancing act between the US and Iran came toppling down. Simon Maybon, you're a professor of international relations at Lancaster University in the UK, where you research Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the geopolitics of the Gulf. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So let's go back to September 2019. A drone attack begins at Abqa Kuras, an oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia. What's happening?
I think this is actually a really significant moment in Saudi and Gulf history. On that day, there were Houthi attacks launched against oil refineries in Saudi Arabia. Now, the Houthis are this zealous religious group based out of Yemen, and they were embroiled in a conflict with Saudi Arabia. They were using drones that had been made in Iran.
An onslaught of more than 24 Iranian-made drones and low-flying cruise missiles crippled the kingdom's oil production.
It was something that really struck at the heart of the Saudi public consciousness. Now, the damage wasn't all that substantial. It wasn't really destructive, but it was quite symbolic. And as a consequence of the drone attacks and the reluctance of Saudi Arabia's main military backer, the United States, to do anything, I think Saudi defensive posturing and Saudi Arabia's approach to regional politics changed dramatically. It had long relied on the United States for its security. And I say long, I'm dating back to 1945, a meeting between Ibn Saud and the US president of the time, meeting on board an aircraft carrier and thrashing out a deal, essentially, security for oil. And that had been in place ever since. And then it seemed that the Saudis could no longer rely on the United States for their security. They were increasingly worried that they were being left to go at it on their own. And so what started to happen is the Saudis realized that if they wanted to enact their domestic reform, they had to find a way of working alongside Iran and with Iran rather than against Iran. And Iran had been their rival for decades.
So move on a few years later, and in April 2021, the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia and Iran sit down together in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, and begin a series of talks.
An offer of mediation from Baghdad and the growing feud between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
How do we get to this point?
So at that point, Saudi Arabia is in the sort of the early phases of a new set of rulers. King Salman and his son, the de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, had come to power. And they were trying to enact this political vision that's known as Vision 2030. It was an ambitious socioeconomic vision, trying to transform the nature of the Saudi kingdom, but it was an expensive vision. It was trying to move the kingdom away from its reliance purely on oil. And it was going to cost a lot of money. It was going to require a lot of foreign direct investment. And it was going to require the building of these futuristic projects. So NEOM, for example, the line, getting the World Cup. Now, early on in MBS's rule, there was the Jamal Khashoggi incident, where the CIA reported that he had given the order for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi dissident, in a Turkish consulate. Now, that really shook a lot of confidence in Saudi Arabia from external investors. And alongside that, I think MBS started to learn that in order to enact his vision, he had to have investor confidence and regional stability. He couldn't have investor confidence if he was acting in a way that had been somewhat reckless, that involved the targeted killing of dissidents, that involved talking about the Iranians as being, and I quote, worse than Hitler. Couldn't do that. That wasn't going to instill investors with confidence. So I think he starts to come to a realization that a different way of doing politics had to be found. And at the same time, the 2019 attacks made him realize that they couldn't necessarily rely on the United States for their security in the long term. And so what we start to see then is this existential transformation of the ways in which the Saudis were thinking about and dealing with the Iranians. We start to see diplomatic overtures. We start to see back-channel dialogue being opened up. We start to see these tractor diplomatic efforts, these sort of meetings of semi-official people, academics, think tankers, getting into a room and just trying to talk, to dispel these notions about the other being this demonic evil threat, if you will. And that eventually transformed the landscape.
Tell us, if you can, why from the exterior it might be so surprising that Iran and Saudi were sitting down together. I mean, what's the history here? Why had relations been so hostile in the previous years?
So these are two of the dominant powers in both the Persian Gulf and the wider Middle East. And they've got a long, complex history. Saudi Arabia, which is broadly a Sunni state, and Iran being a Shia state. These came to a head in 1979 with the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the establishment of a system known as Velayat-e-Faqih, the regency of the jurist, by Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And what Khamenei did is he started to attack the Saudis rhetorically, saying that they were unfit to be the custodians of the two holy places of Mecca and Medina. That obviously antagonized the Saudis. They were trying to then discursively frame Khomeini as being evil and trying to diminish the credibility of the new Islamic Republic. And then what starts to happen is Iran provides support for groups across the region who wish to change the status quo. So we see Iran setting up Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, and providing support to opposition groups around the region, trying to, for the Saudis at least, undermine regional order, undermine the regional status quo. And this really fuels the antagonism. Now, it gets to the early 1990s and things start to change a little bit. The death of Ruhollah Khomeini opens up a little bit of space in Iran for a different type of politics. And then you start to see new Iranian leaders working with a younger generation of Saudi princes, including Crown Prince Abdullah at the time, to try and improve relations. They start to make good progress. And then 9/11 happens, and the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. And that's where things really start to deteriorate. Iraq descends into a civil war along sect-based lines. Iran's providing support to one party, Saudi Arabia providing support to another, and it really starts to come to a head. The story that was recalled in WikiLeaks cables and then reported by various global news outlets, in which King Abdullah, who said to his American counterparts, "I urge you to cut off the head of the snake." And by that, what he's meaning is essentially to undertake a military strike on Iran. Now, that doesn't happen, but that tells you something about how antagonistic, how fraught relations were. And they only got worse during the Arab uprisings in the 2010s, culminating in the 2019 drone attacks on Saudi Aramco facilities.
So this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran then that was happening in 2021, 2022, it was a real break from that past. And then China stepped in and brokered a formal normalization deal in March 2023 in Beijing between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
The announcement came after discussions in China, and both sides have been quoted praising Beijing's role in the process. The countries have had no formal ties since 2016.
What was actually agreed in that deal?
It was agreed that they would reopen embassies and that they would work towards properly normalizing relations. And to be fair, it started to work. They reopened diplomatic initiatives. They expressed joint statements in support of one another. They did joint military drills. It looked like things were broadly positive, that attitudes were changing as well. For example, Persian food in Riyadh, the Saudi capital, became incredibly popular. And some of the Saudi think tanks that were previously taking really hard lines against Iran, were softening. They were changing their stances. So all of this sort of pointed to a thawing in relations and an improvement in the ways in which the two states were dealing with one another.
At the same time, Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia very much included, had long been courting the United States. They'd been playing host to its military bases, and some countries, including Bahrain and the UAE, had even begun normalizing ties with Israel under the Abraham Accords during the first Trump administration. How much of a political balancing act was it to do the rapprochement with Iran, but at the same time hold on to that important military relationship with the US?
Yeah, it's a real delicate one because on the one side, you have a long-standing security arrangement with the United States, but a long-standing set of security relationships that aren't all that popular with domestic publics. If we go back to the early 1990s, for example, the American base in Saudi was set up after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And there was an offer from Osama bin Laden to the Saudi royal family to provide his mujahideen, if you will, who had been fighting in Afghanistan. He offered them to the Saudi king to say, look, we can protect the kingdom against Iraq. But the king chose to go with the Americans. And that provoked some serious antagonism and serious anger across the Saudi state, who were very critical that non-Muslims had been invited into the land of the two holy mosques. That led to serious criticisms of the Saudi regime. It was less so in other states by virtue of different sort of religious and social fabrics. But in Saudi, it was a really big thing. But then at the same time, they'd also realized that they're in a particular neighborhood. They had to work with Iran. They had to live alongside Iran. So balancing that, I think, was deemed to be really quite important in order for the Saudis, for the Emiratis, for the Bahrainis, for the Qataris to enact their various transformative vision projects. I think they all realized that you can't do that without having regional stability. And the only way you could get regional stability is to integrate Iran to some way, shape, or form. Now, there was going to be a real delicate balancing act with regard to Israel, because how can you normalize relations with Iran and with Israel at the same time? And the Saudis, they didn't get to the point where they had to choose. They were normalizing with Iran. There were talks about normalizing with Israel. But the terrorist attacks of October the 7th put paid to that.
How did Hamas-led terrorist attacks on October the 7th in 2023 and then the Gaza war change the dynamics of the Gulf-Iranian relations?
It speaks to different readings of how close the Saudis were to normalizing with Israel. Some would say that it was a done deal and that the October 7 terrorist attacks ended it because it was then deemed impossible to normalize at a time when Israel was engaging in such acts against Hamas and against Gazans. Now, others that I've spoken to would say, well, actually, the Saudis weren't that close, but it was read as being closer than it was. But the Bahrainis, the Emiratis have been criticized heavily for their signing of the Abraham Accords. I think it was last week that a Saudi official referred to the UAE as an Israeli proxy. And it points to the Saudi-Emirati rivalry that's emerged in recent months. And it shows you how toxic for some the Abraham Accords have become.
In June 2025, Israel and the US bombed nuclear facilities in Iran in what's now being called the 12-day war.
Israel warned hundreds of thousands of Tehran residents to evacuate a central district of the Iranian capital today as the air campaign it began early Friday morning continued for a fourth day. Iranian strikes also targeted Tel Aviv and other major cities.
In retaliation, Iran launched missiles at a US airbase in Qatar, and then a few months later, the Israeli military conducted an airstrike in the Qatari capital Doha, which targeted senior Hamas leaders during a negotiation.
Qatar, well, they have described the strike as a blatant violation of international law. The UN chief, Antonio Guterres, said it was a flagrant violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Qatar.
How did those attacks in that moment change Gulf countries' view of their own security?
Hugely, I think. I was in Doha at the Doha Forum, a big diplomatic event that happens annually, hosted by the Qataris. And the Qatari Prime Minister was speaking about these two events. And he was hugely critical of Israel and hugely critical of the United States for not giving Qatar enough warning about what was happening. And I think that's one of the ways in which Doha has managed to exert pressure on the United States for a deeper and more sort of a closer defense alignment, if you will. But I think the more sort of telling thing for now is the way that he spoke about Iran. And he was critical of the argument that was put forward by the Iranians to justify their strike on the Al Udeid airbase. And this strike was being justified as a strike not on Doha, not on Qatar, but on the US base by the Iranians. Now, the Qataris didn't buy this. They said, no, it's not. This is a strike on Qatar. We are fraternal brothers. We are overlooking the Persian Gulf together. And you have just struck a blow on a neighbor. We're seeing the same argument being made by Iranian leaders that they are attacking US bases across the Gulf during this latest conflict. But that argument is again being refuted by leaders in Doha, in Abu Dhabi, in Riyadh, in Manama. They are saying these are attacks on Arab Gulf neighbors.
Since that moment, there's been months of mounting tensions between the US and Iran and a significant US military buildup in the region. Yet, at the same time, some Gulf countries have also been pursuing a diplomatic solution to the crisis, particularly Oman, which has been hosting talks between the US and Iran. Were Gulf states, do you think, really confident that diplomacy could avert a US-led war on Iran?
The short answer is, I don't know. The speculative answer is, I think so, or at least they were hopeful of it. And I say this because on Saturday morning, there was news reported that Oman was hopeful that a diplomatic breakthrough could be reached. And then a minute or two later, there was news breaking that the US had struck Iran. And so I think the Omanis were confident that they could negotiate a deal. I think that MBS wanted a deal. He wanted that stability. I think the Emiratis wanted stability. The Qataris wanted stability. No one wanted to have a war in the Gulf because they've seen the devastation that could emerge in Iraq post-2003. They've seen the destruction of Syria. They've seen the destruction of Yemen. They've seen the destruction of Libya, of Lebanon. You can keep going, of course. Iraq in 2003, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, was a real terrible, bleak, violent period of instability and precarious politics. And that did not do anyone any good in the region for political, social, economic conditions, improving ways of life, encouraging investment, etc., etc. And now we've got leaders in the Gulf who are very keen on those things. And so the idea of targeting Ali Khamenei, killing him, and then hoping that this will facilitate some type of peaceful transformation seems like a huge gamble to me. And I don't think that Gulf leaders are willing to take gambles right now. This is a very delicate time in their political trajectories.
Coming up, as the US and Israel continue to bomb Iran, Gulf states are now under attack from Iranian drones. Where can they go from here? That's after this short break.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.
The day after the war began, the Washington Post reported that Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman actually pressured Trump to bomb Iran alongside Israel, even though they have subsequently condemned the attacks.
Well, according to a report by the Washington Post, US President Donald Trump ordered a strike on Iran after weeks of sustained pressure from two powerful regional allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and the consequences for Saudi Arabia of its alleged role in the Iran attacks appear to be unfolding already.
What do you make of that line of reporting?
I was very surprised, and I thought it goes against everything that the Saudis have been doing for the past 5, 6, 7 years now. If this had been before 2019, I should say, it would not have surprised me to hear MBS urging Donald Trump, or any other US president for that matter, to strike Iran. But after that point, a lot of political, social, economic, cultural capital has gone into improving relations with Iran. And speaking with Saudi friends, they don't buy it either. They were equally surprised by the narrative coming out that said MBS had been pushing for it. It doesn't add up.
Why do you think then that narrative has been pushed?
So it's pure speculation, but I think it really starts to pull the US and Saudi Arabia closer together against Iran if the perception in Iran is that Saudi has been pushing for war. It also murkies the waters a little bit. We're seeing a lot of disinformation right now. I think we're seeing a real battle to own the narrative.
So now Iran has struck back.
An Iranian ballistic missile hit the United States military base at Al Udeid.
Tonight here in the UAE, there was a constant barrage of attacks across Dubai and also
as Tehran struck targets across the Gulf in retaliation for US-Israeli attacks.
We've got attacks on multiple US bases across the region. We've got attacks on oil and gas facilities, on the US embassy in Riyadh. Do you think that the Gulf states thought this might happen this quickly?
I think few were really expecting it to spread quite so quickly. And now most of the states across the Gulf have been hit by Iranian drones. We've seen Iranian planes shot down over Qatar. We've seen an Israeli invasion into South Lebanon, land grabs. We're also starting to see infrastructure being hit in the Gulf. We're seeing suggestions that Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz. So that logistical flows of oil and other goods that are vital to the global economy. And Iran is clearly at a point of desperation now that it's trying to lash out and put pressure on whoever it can to get the United States and Israel to stop the military campaign.
There's been some comments by analysts in the Gulf that they're frustrated at the lack of support they've had from the US in protecting themselves from these attacks from Iran. There was a Saudi analyst on Al Jazeera a couple of days ago who said they've abandoned us. Is that feeling, do you think, growing, this idea going back right to the beginning that the Americans haven't protected anything other than their own bases?
Yeah, I think the American response would be, we're doing this to protect you, that we're engaging in the bombing of Iran to protect you from the Islamic Republic. But I don't think it's particularly surprising that the Americans have looked after their own bases and their own interests. That is a pattern that we are seeing from US actions under Donald Trump. It's America first. But then the argument would be, I think, that America's military strikes on Iran are for the safety and security of the region.
Does this moment then, in your view, accelerate Gulf countries moving closer into the US-Israeli orbit? Could it really shift the dynamics of the region in that way?
I think it's going to be really, really difficult to rebuild the trust that had been cultivated over years between the Gulf Arab states and Iran. And I guess that raises questions about security then. How do you get your security? How do you ensure that your state is safe, your people are secure in a conflict situation or indeed in a post-conflict situation? We don't know what's going to come out of the situation in Iran. We don't know if we're going to see a weakened Islamic Republic, or if we're going to see an emboldened Islamic Republic, or if we're going to see a vacuum, or if we're going to see the return of the Crown Prince, for that matter. And then there are all of the different questions about foreign policy agendas, about instability, about control over different groups within Iran. And they all those questions pose serious challenges to Gulf Arab states and their security. So what do they do? Do they try and go it alone? Do they try and have a GCC sort of forward-thinking force, if you will? Or do you double down on the US and Israel?
Say the Gulf states were really to start engaging in this war in a much bigger way. What kind of military capacity do they have?
Well, they've got wonderful kit. They've got the best weapons in the world, the best planes, the best software, the best equipment that you could buy. But then have you got the personnel? And I think that's a big thing that Gulf militaries are realizing, that they are not self-sufficient. They've got wonderful officers, many of whom have trained at Sandhurst and have spent a lot of time working alongside British military officials. But they don't have the same level of armies that larger states have outside of the Gulf. And I don't think that should be all that surprising, given the relative sizes of some of these Gulf states, which are very small. Qatar has a population of about 2 million people, for example. So there's no way that its military is going to be anywhere near as powerful as Iran's, for example. So the extent to which it's able to actually operate militarily on their own, I think, is a very big question.
For years, then, Simon, the Gulf has been marketing itself as this hub for finance, for leisure, an oasis of security in this fragile region. And a lot of people around the world bought into that. They moved their money there, they travelled there, they know people who live there. Was that vision of the Gulf a mirage in some way? And what does this mean for that longer-term project?
I think if you scratch beneath the surface, there was always a dark side to the Gulf, whether it's the migrant workers who were there building the huge projects, who were there cleaning, the invisible workers in the hotels, in the homes that were doing the jobs that Gulfies didn't want to do. There was always a darkness to it that was the sort of the mirror image, if you will, of the utopia, of the beautiful weather, of the opulence, the vast wealth. And that tension is exacerbated by looking beneath the surface of the geopolitical landscape of the region. So I think there has been that sheet pulled away. The mirage has started to reveal itself as a mirage rather than reality, that there is this darkness.
Thanks so much, Simon, for coming on. It's been fascinating talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more analysis on The Conversation about the Iran conflict from researchers around the world. We'll put some links to further reading in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani and me, Gemma Ware, with assistance from Katie Flood. Sound mixing is by Eleanor Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter too by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you value what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It does really help us reach new people. Thanks for listening.
Hiya, I'm Katie Edwards, and I'm a health editor at The Conversation.
I'm Dan Baumgart. I'm a lecturer in health and life sciences at the University of Bristol, where I also work as a GP.
And we work together a lot, and we try to explain weird and wonderful things about the body. And now we're teaming up to host Strange Health, which is a new video podcast from The Conversation.
So each episode, we're going to be taking a health trend going viral on social media.
You know the kind of thing. Drink chlorophyll to make sure you don't stink.
Do you really need to detox in January?
Have a supplement to make your bum look better. All that kind of thing. Each week, it's going to be me and Dan, plus an expert, who are going to thrash out between the truths and the myths.
You know, me being an anatomist, I was like, can I have a look? And it was huge.
The liver is amazing. It's probably the only organ that can regenerate itself completely.
And we're calling it Strange Health because we're not scared of disgusting things. Episode 1 arrives on the 20th of January. So follow us on YouTube or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.